everybody. This is International Master Jesse Kraai with a chess lecture presentation on the Smith-Morra Gambit. Now, the Smith-Morra Gambit begins like this: e4, c5, d4, pawn takes, c3, pawn takes, knight takes. Okay. So let's talk about this position for just a second and try to figure out what's going on. Clearly, white's down a pawn, but in return for that pawn, we can tell he's up one tempo because his knight's out, and let's say two more because black is going to owe white two more pawn moves before he can complete his development. He'll have to, for example, if he wants to put his knight on f6, he'll have to play pawn to d6, and if he wants to bring out his bishop on f8, he'll have to play e6. So he's basically due two more pawn moves, and pawn moves really aren't developing moves. So in that sense, it's about equal. As Bill Pascal pointed out in his lecture on chess and tempo, a piece or a pawn is usually worth about 3 tempo, or tempi. Okay, so that means it's about equal in terms of that relationship. And the next question we would have to ask is how things stand in terms of the quality of the position. And in order to address that question, what I'd like to do is just go back to the very beginning and talk about this position in relation to the normal Sicilian position. Okay, let's go back. So normally what white does if he doesn't want to sacrifice a pawn is he would play knight f3, and then black has a choice of many moves here: d6, e6, knight c6. Let's just say he plays d6. d4, we have to make this move if we want both bishops to have scope. Pawn takes, knight takes, knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn, and now knight c3. So, this variation of the Sicilian, like many others, share one common characteristic, and that is that white's pieces, in particular his minor pieces, right, the knights and the bishops, are much more active than black's. Okay, so why would black then want this opening? Why is this such a popular opening? And the reason is that black has basically an extra pawn in the center. And this will be the case no matter how he sets up his pawns. He can set up his pawns on d6 and e5. He can leave the pawn on d7 and put one on e6. He can play d6 and g6, the dragon. So many different ways for black to play. Okay, so, but the commonality to all of those is black will have an extra center pawn in compensation, let's say, to white's piece activity. Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. A real problem for white here is that this pawn on c2 isn't doing anything. It's not doing anything in the center. And it's just kind of stuck there. And it's not fighting for the center like black's two beautiful pawns on e7 and d6 are. And I think that's a key fact in understanding why the Smith-Morra is a viable option here for white. So let's go all the way back and now look at the Smith-Morra. We play d4 directly, like in the normal Sicilian. If we want advantage, we have to have both of our bishops out. Pawn takes, c3, pawn takes, knight takes. So now we get a similar position. Black still has a center pawn, but instead of having our pawn on c2, we purposely chucked it away for the sake of gaining time in the opening and of opening scope for the queen, and we'll see later, actually, it's really important, opening scope for possibly a rook on the c file. Okay, now, I really recommend the Smith-Morra Gambit for players who like tactical attacking positions with the initiative, and particularly scholastic players, I think, can do very well with this. I myself played this opening when I was rated, say, from 13 or 1400 all the way to around 2100, and I think it's a very viable option, especially at that level. I found found also playing the black side of the Sicilian that I really don't like to face this at all, because white always has the chances of really smashing black, and really one small mistake from black at this point is going to lead to complete destruction. Okay, so what I think I'll do now is I'll look at kind of some standard plans for white and how things can develop here. I think what I want to mention here, though, is that what we'll find is that white is given a pawn for 3 tempi, but at the same time, what we're going to find is that he's going to have an enduring initiative, and that's the most important thing when we talk about sacrificing a pawn, when there's no clear-cut way to smash through black's defenses. We want to have something that's not just going to go away in a matter of moves. Okay, so clearly the most natural place for black's knight is on c6. We'll just continue developing naturally. And like I said, if he wants to bring out this knight on f6, he's got to first play d6 so that we cannot push e5. Now bishop c4. And now a kind of curious thing happens to black. He has to be very careful on this move. It turns out that this move, knight f6, is not a very good move. And that's what we could call maybe a good omen for white. If a natural move like that doesn't work, it usually means that our opening scheme is at least in part justified. And the reason for this knight f6 not working is a very nice tactical series. And white can play now e5. Okay, what are we doing? Well, let's look at a couple responses possibly for black. The worst response for black would be to take with a knight, because then white can play knight takes knight, pawn takes, bishop takes pawn, winning the black queen. Very awful trap. So the next logical response would be to play pawn takes pawn. And here white can do something I think very interesting. He can actually trade queens. We're 2 pawns down, but we can trade queens. And now if knight takes queen, we can play knight b5, threatening the fork. And black's actually in a really bad way, because if he plays king d7, something horrible will happen to him. We'll have knight takes pawn, king e8, knight c7, checkmate. Amazing variation. So he really has to play rook b8 as his only move, after which we can simply take the pawn. We're threatening mate by knight c7. And after e6, we really just have a nice choice here between knight c7, driving out the queen, or simply taking the pawn on a7, where we've regained the material and we simply have to have a nice advantage because we're better developed. Plus we have a queen, what's called a queenside majority, 2 against 1. So let's go back. That didn't work out for black either. And now the last option really is knight g4. But then white can use a nice tactic and play e6. And the point is, we're going to block the communication of this bishop on c8 to the knight on g4. So for example, if pawn takes pawn now we can play knight g5, opening up an attack onto this knight and threatening this pawn. And in this position, I'd have to say white is definitely better, clearly better, because black's defenses are ruined, and it's only at the cost of a pawn that we've got this huge position. Okay, so let's go back. That's generally why knight f6 is a mistake. And I reckon if you play the Smith-Morra Gambit, you'll have many games with knight f6. Just a huge percentage of your opponents are going to play this very natural move, which is actually a mistake. So, what to do for black? Well, there's several things he can do. Probably the most logical is just to play e6. And this we'll call the main line. Now, I want to just state that there's many different ways that black can respond to the Smith-Morra. And what I'm going to try to show, without showing all of the variations, is the general ideas for white, which we'll see in this main variation. Okay, so like again, there's many different ways to play for black, and I think maybe even a good chess lecture presentation might be on how to respond in the best possible way to the Smith-Morra, and maybe someone else can do that, because I'm actually a believer in the Smith-Morra, but someone else, maybe Bill Pascal, could really give us a good way for black to play. But in all of those different variations, we'll find the same ideas, strategical and tactical themes for white. I'd also like to mention that my fellow commentator, Dave Vigorito, was originally going to do, there was a suggestion for him to do the Smith-Morra, and he passed it on to me. And the reason for that is simply that I believe in this opening. I actually believe that white is at least dynamically equal here. I think he might even have a small advantage, whereas other players are a little hesitant to give a pawn away so early in the opening. I especially think, however, that it's really good, like I said, for anyone in that category of 1300 to 2100. And the main reason for that is simply that you'll be able to win a lot of games tactically, and it'll also sharpen your own tactical ability by playing those types of positions. Okay, so let's return to this position. E6, castles. Very natural, logical move. Knight f6, queen e2. Now this is very important, this setup that white's building here, and we'll see in just a moment. Bishop e7, very logical, trying to castle, and now rook d1. And here we see the first main facet of white's long-term enduring initiative, that he's got this file now to the queen. And this is actually a serious problem for black. If black now castles, I've had this position many times as white as well, he'll find himself in dire trouble after e5. And analysis has just shown that there's no way that black can let e5 happen, because once the knight moves, we'll take the pawn, and if the pawn is taken back, we can just follow the velocity of pin and win with knight b5 and bishop f4, putting pressure on that d6 square. So black basically has to waste time to stop that move e5, and he has to then play e5 himself. Let's just think about what's happened here. And in general, I think a good rule of thumb is anytime a pawn move is made, you should rethink the dynamics of the position, because the pawn moves will determine the structure of the play and the possibilities for strategical plan. So e5, clearly our main thrust, e5 has been stopped, but on the other hand, black's given certain concessions, okay? And those really are now backward pawn on d6, a hole on d5. Maybe I should clarify those terms. The backward pawn is simply a pawn that can't move forward and has nothing to support him from behind. A hole is a square where my pieces can jump into without being pushed away by an enemy pawn. So really black now has to constantly be worried about, in particular, knight d5 coming in at some critical juncture to really disrupt black's play. And another kind of enduring factor that we've just got is this bishop now eyeing the key f7 square. And even though nothing is happening there yet, that's now going to be a permanent factor in the position that black always is going to have to be careful about. Okay, so e5. And I think white now can be satisfied and say to himself, well, now I don't even have to play that fast anymore. I can slow the tempo down and just build the position. Play h3. Critical move, really, because black was threatening to play bishop g4 and then maybe knight d4, disrupting our own play. Then h3 is just a solid building move. Castles. Bishop e3. And now we'll find that no matter what black does, he has some critical problems. One is what to do with the bishop. Where should it go? If it goes to e6, well, we can take and we'll have enduring play there too. The next problem is the queen. Where does the queen go? For example, in most Sicilian positions, what Sicilian players like to do is they like to play queen c7. In the Smith-Morra Gambit, however, it turns out that the queen doesn't feel too comfortable on c7. Let's say she were to go there now. Now we play rook c1. And we can see, even though there's a couple pieces in the way, the black queen is going to feel very uncomfortable because we're going to be threatening things like knight d5 and opening up that c-file. And this position right here, I think we could call kind of the basic setup for white. Again, black can play many different things, but this is the basic setup we'll be striving for. All of our pieces are doing things, and these two rooks are bearing down on the black position. Again, the black queen is going to feel uncomfortable. Notice it can't go here. Sometimes it can go there on a5, but it can be harassed with moves like a3 or b4. And if he goes back to d8, he'll be safe there. But on the other hand, the queen won't be around the black king if white starts an attack on the king side, which is always an eminent possibility. So, again, this is just a very simple way for white to play against the Sicilian. I recommend it for players between, say, 1,300 and 2,100. And one other factor I'd like to just mention in favor of the Smith-Morra is that if you play the normal variations, the traditional variations, the e4, c5, knight f3, black moves one of his moves, d6 or whatever, and we play d4. What we have to be really prepared for is the fact that we have to learn all kinds of different Sicilian variations. There are so many, with so many exotic names, the dragon, the Khan, the Taimanov, the Najdorf, all these variations that we really have to know very well, and even then it's not even assured that we're going to get an advantage. And we have to know so much theory, because the black player who plays that is going to be really very booked up in terms of how he's going to play those kinds of positions. If we play this setup, then in a sense black has to play in our house, right? He can't really be playing his own brand of chess. He's going to have to be responding to how we play. So one thing I might mention in terms of how to play against the Najdorf, though this really, or not the Najdorf, the Smith-Morra, though this shouldn't really upset us if we're playing it for white, is in this position just to play knight f6. And what's going to happen here is that black says, okay, I don't even want the pawn. And after this kind of position, let's say pawn takes pawn, probably the most natural move, we just have a very simple strategical position where I think white has maybe a small initiative because he's got better control of the center, but black has every reason to believe that he can fight back. Okay, so I'm interested to hear how people think about the Smith-Morra, if they think it's a sound opening or not. And this was a suggestion by one of our listeners, and I think it's a great thing when our listeners ask for a specific opening because it allows us to talk about things that I think are maybe not what is played at the master level, like the Smith-Morra, but I think openings that are still very worthy of being played at, say, the club level. This is International Master Jesse Kraai, and I hope you've enjoyed this chess lecture presentation. Bye-bye.